we've been playing a ton of Cyberpunk 2077's new Phantom Liberty expansion as well as the new 2.0 update. So after getting used to all of these new changes and systems added in and beating the expansion itself, we're going to wrap together all of the tips and tricks and the beginner's stuff that you will probably want to know to make your life easier. So let's not waste your time and let's get into it. First up, you might want to know, do you have to have played the game before and have an old save in order to actually play the new Phantom Liberty expansion? The short answer is no. When you start a new game, you will essentially have two choices. One, to start the game before the events of Phantom Liberty at the very beginning of the base Cyberpunk experience. This will not skip anything, and you can play through all of the base game until you get to Phantom Liberty, which is done by progressing through the main story and doing a quest called Transmission. However, there's another option when you start a new game called Skip Ahead and Play Phantom Liberty, which will allow you to skip ahead in the story to the point at which V begins the Phantom Liberty expansion storyline. All of the content from both Phantom Liberty and the base game will be fully available to you from that point. So you can jump straight into the new stuff if that's what you want to do. But next, let's talk about the new CYBERWEAR system and the capacity cap for it. Within your CYBERWEAR menu, you will now have a sort of bar that will increase as you level up, gain shards that increase your CYBERWEAR capacity, or unlock the Edge Runner perk. But what does this all mean? Essentially, every piece of CYBERWEAR now has a cost attached to it that will add up and increase this bar. Because you have a cap, you will not be able to go beyond a certain point, which means particularly at early and mid game, you cannot have everything at tier 4 or 5 in every single slot. You simply won't have enough capacity. A quick tip that we would recommend is to prioritize what CYBERWEAR is more important to your build. Do you really need a good blood pump to keep yourself alive? Or do you want to put on some stronger arms like some tier 5 mantis blades to shred your enemies and deal more damage? Or maybe you're more of a quick hack player, therefore you need to use those CYBERWEAR pieces that give you more RAM. So depending on your build, try and prioritize which pieces of tier 5 gear you need first, because you will not be able to slot everything in at the same time. And next, let's talk about the new RELIC skill tree, which has a variety of massive perks and even a couple of new effects on it. Do note, however, that some of these perks require specific CYBERWEAR to actually use them. For example, this perk upgrades the active camo CYBERWEAR, so you have to already have it equipped or it does nothing for you. So don't waste your points in this skill unless you're already using active camo. The same goes for the other skills that use things like the mantis blades, gorilla arms, or monowire, so make sure you're investing points in the perks that upgrade the CYBERWEAR you're currently using. Also, the weak point perk is probably one of the best ones to start off with, that is unless you really plan to go full melee. The skill points for this relic tree are given to you from certain expansion missions, but they're also in collectible stations that are scattered around Dogtown. Vehicle combat has also been added into the game that makes those vehicle engagements much more interesting. There are specific perks in several different skill trees that actually buff your vehicle and its combat capabilities, and one skill is required if you actually want to use quick hacks on enemy vehicles. Interestingly, the way that you now get vehicles in the game is not through fixers on your phone. Instead, there are vehicle vendors that you can just straight buy them from, and at these vendors, the different vehicles will have icons that show you what type of weapons they have built in. So if you have a vehicle with its own weapon or two built in, you can cycle between those while driving and shoot them instead of using your actual player's weapon. Next up, you should know there are actual events that can happen outside of side gigs and quests in the form of airdrops and courier missions. As you explore, you will often see a crash landing of an airdrop with a big red smoke flare signal in the sky, as well as some loud beeping. These happen randomly from time to time, but they're well worth it for all of the goodies that you get. There are also courier missions that involve you stealing a vehicle marked on your map that will pop up randomly, and you will then have to drive it to a set location, which often triggers a chase and some cool vehicle combat. Out of these two types of dynamic events, there are actually several different ways in which they can occur. For airdrops, you have retake, where there's a small number of enemies that you'll have to defeat. There's also the shootout, where there will be a swarm of enemies around the drop zone, so you have to kill a lot of enemies to get to it. There's an ambush type, where the drop zone seems empty, but enemies will appear after you grab the loot. There's also grab, which is basically your lucky day. No one is around the airdrop, so it's just free goodies for you. And then there are some custom ones which come with their own dedicated narrative elements. Meanwhile, for the courier missions, you have chase, which is where enemy vehicles will spawn and start attacking you. You also have timer or no damage, which require you to be both quick and careful by completing it within a set time and not taking too much damage on your vehicle. And then you have hacking, which requires you to use special tech to hack the enemy's car first in order to retrieve it. And next is of course the new skill tree. They've completely changed and revamped all of the perks in the skill tree, so all of your perk points will have reset and you will have to reassign them if you go back to an old save. This rework is meant to make the skill tree more impactful to your gameplay. Each different skill tree will often lead you into specific weapon types and combat playstyles. For me personally, within the body skill tree, there are a bunch of perks that essentially buff the blood pump cyberware. The blood pump is a piece of cyberware that you can actively use in combat that heals you and then gives you additional healing over time. The great thing is, by leaning into these perks, it will actually overheal you with adrenaline, which further buffs your movement speed, your damage mitigation, as well as making you immune to certain effects, so this is a fantastic skill tree to go in if you want to be very survivable. This brings me on to another thing that you want to know. The way that grenades and healing items now work is that they are basically cooldown items, so once you have a heal item or grenade, you don't have to craft any more or buy any more of them. You simply throw them, they go on cooldown, and then they come back and you can throw them again. So getting some tier 5 items of these types basically means you always have that available to you, and you just have to wait for the cooldown in combat. For this reason, you might want to craft or buy some tier 5 healing items or grenades relatively early on or as soon as you can. And next up, we're going to touch on the choices and how Phantom Liberty fits into the base Cyberpunk 2077 story. Phantom Liberty is kind of like a self-contained story taking place during the events of the base Cyberpunk game. It also adds an additional ending to Cyberpunk, which depends on the choices you make along your journey in Dogtown. However, there's also some important branching path choices that result in a turning point in the story, which of course I will not spoil for you, but there is a very important choice at a certain point that will lead you down essentially 2 different endings. And depending on which of these 2 choices you make, you will also then lead on to get an entirely new ending for the entire game. This new ending can then be done to finish the game completely, or can be saved if you wish to do other stuff in the base Cyberpunk story and the quests around the rest of the map. So depending on which choice you choose at a certain point, it will be obvious when you get there, you will have dramatically different experiences, both in terms of their narrative, the unique missions you go on, the locations you go to, the opponents that you'll be fighting, and the ending for each. I want to go into more detail, but I also don't want to spoil it for you. So what you want to know is that there's an important choice at a certain point. It lends well to the replayability of the game, as well as save scumming if you want to experience both relatively quickly. So save often or go back to your auto saves if you don't like the way the story is progressing after making a major choice. So now you're up to date on most of the major changes that will impact you when you jump back into Cyberpunk and experience Phantom Liberty. We hope this helps you out, and if you have any tips to share, make sure to put them in the comments down below so we can all learn together as a community. We have loads more stuff coming your way soon that you don't want to miss out on, so stay subscribed, check out these 2 videos or the other videos on the channel, and then tell us what you think after watching in the comments down below.